Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my MSI day number 7 overview and analysis video in the main stage. It's lower bracket round 2, and we're closing out lower bracket round 2 with this series here today. Of course, we covered the first one of these second round lower bracket series yesterday, the series between Anyone's Legend and the Flying Oysters. You can check that out on this channel alongside every other game that's happened at MSI so far, where we break this down in depth. But today, we really get to kind of turn things up a notch. One of the most interesting series of the entire tournament, both on paper and in execution, ended up happening, and I'm super excited to talk about it. Let me know what you guys thought of it down in the comment section below. Always curious to know your thoughts and opinions on how these series go, what your expectations were for them going into it, and whether or not they lived up to those. But let's go ahead and get into things. If you are new here, if you've not been around the channel, what we're going to do is go game by game, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, we will be looking at the bracket by the end of the video. Very interesting to talk about because the winner of this series will already have their opponent decided going into round 3. It's going to be Anyone's Legend. Whoever wins this is going to have to take them on, so it does not get easier from here, but definitely going to talk about whether or not I think that's a good or a bad matchup, and we've still got winners finals to preview, which is coming up tomorrow, so a lot to talk about in MSI, still kind of moving forward, but most of today will be spent talking about the series that we got last night, and boy, am I excited to talk about it, so let's get into it. The series, obviously, as you already know, if you clicked on this video, is a matchup between the number 2 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming and the number 1 seed from the LTA in FlyQuest. And the reason this is so interesting is because this really does feel like the closest a Western team has been to beating one of the upper tier, like LPL or LCK teams in quite a while. G2 has had some opportunities over the past couple of years, and they've been pretty successful, especially at MSI, at this tournament in particular, but North America has really not had this opportunity in quite a long time. And you know what? This is a really good matchup for NA, and I think this is one that they can genuinely look at and say, well, we can win this if everything ends up going right, because as much as I like BLG, and as much as I do think they actually are a very good team, likely top 5 in the world, their specific matchup against FlyQuest is actually pretty bad, especially on paper. So let's go ahead and get into it. I already talked about this a bit in the preview, but for BLG, what are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Luckily, they're a very easy team to talk about because they are pretty one-dimensional in terms of how they play the game. Same with FlyQuest. They have a very defined style in terms of what they are as a team, which makes it easier to talk about what they're good at versus what they're bad at. For BLG, what are they good at? They're incredibly mechanically talented. These are some of the best players in the entire world, just in terms of raw ability to play the game. Players like Knight, players like Bin, players like Elk and On. Like, they are some of the most talented players in the world, and we saw that last year when this team made a run to World Finals, and obviously it's not quite been the same so far in 2025. You've had some underperformances from players like Bin throughout a lot of the LPL split. Players like Elk, I don't think were particularly consistent throughout the entirety of the LPL split, but really, BLG's biggest strength is that they're really consistently able to generate leads as long as they're left alone in a lot of these lanes. If they can play 1v1 or 2v2, they're likely just going to be better, not only than FlyQuest, but than a lot of other people at this tournament in terms of generating gold and being able to push the game forward early. Their biggest weakness is not only their mid-game decision-making, but their ability to play as a team. They're really not a team right now. There's not a lot of ways that I can really quantify that more than just kind of telling you, but, you know, Beichuan came in to try and fix this problem, and I think he did to a smaller extent. There were things that I think were big issues that have become smaller issues for BLG, and, you know, I would say Beichuan coming in overway is the big reason why they're at this tournament to begin with, that they're top 2 in the LPL, but this team still is not very good at, like, playing professional League of Legends. They're just very talented, and I think that means that they are pretty exploitable in the back half of games. This team really likes to generate gold early, and they like to draft big leads, but they're also very proficient at throwing those big leads because they have no idea what they're supposed to be doing. They're consistently out of position in the late game, and especially their mid-game decision-making is very bad in terms of how to grow their gold lead, and that's something that FlyQuest can really take advantage of. So BLG, a pretty easy team to talk about, but genuinely, when you look across the board, the reason I favored BLG in this series is because it's just hard to imagine that there are a lot of lanes where FlyQuest is genuinely better. Is Bwipo better than Bin? No. Is Quad better than Knight? No. Are Maso and Busio better than Elk and On? No. Like, on paper, you wouldn't say that they're talented enough to be able to compete with those other teams, and so, or those players, and so, you know, it's tough for me to imagine a world where BLG just don't get those big leads, but, you know, if FlyQuest can stall out games, which obviously we'll talk about in a second, that could be really bad for BLG, and for Fly, Fly, the reason this is such a bad matchup for BLG is what is Fly really good at? Well, they're not a particularly good early game team, but also they're really good at kind of making that not matter all that much. I would argue that they might be the best team in the entire world at delaying the game, at prolonging games and making them go longer. They're just very good at being able to stall, and I think that that's something that actually is really valuable for them because their late game decision making and their team fighting is genuinely some of the best in the world. Like, can you argue that individually, from a player perspective, from a laning perspective, these players are not on the same level as players from BLG? Absolutely, you can absolutely make that argument. But what I will counter that with is the fact that, at least for Fly and the playstyle that they play and the way that they get there, it doesn't really matter. Like, they never really fall into positions where they need to be able to generate early leads, and they can when they need to, right? Like, bot lane in particular is going to be a lane that you can play through and really win if you have to. And one lane that I think you do actually have an upper leg on, or I guess one matchup you have an upper leg on, is Inspired versus Beichuan in the jungle. I think Inspired is just a better player. I had him rated as the higher jungler coming into this tournament, and I think that that's kind of proven itself to be true. Beichuan really struggled against T1. In fact, he looked quite bad in that series against T1. He even had his own problems against Elyoya in round number 1, and I think Inspired has looked great at this tournament so far. He was okay against anyone's legend, but that's a really tough matchup, and he destroyed G2, not single-handedly, but certainly was a big part of it. So, you know, I'm really excited to see what happens here, because if Inspired can actually generate some pressure in the early game, and if Beichuan can't actually answer that, it might not even matter that some of the lanes are going in favor of BLG. That's FlyQuest's way to win the game. If they can draft these late game team comps, allow Inspired to be able to run the map and specifically try to play through their good decision making in the mid and late game, that's their pathway to success. And for BLG, you just have to stop that. You have to keep your foot on the gas. If you can get these gigantic gold leads going into the mid game, it's going to be hard for FlyQuest to just skill diff their way back into games, even if they have scaling comps. So, you know, the stakes are set, the stage is set in general, and I'm really excited to see how it plays out. Like I said, my prediction was BLG 3-2. I think Fly is more than good enough to, at the very least, win one game of this series. I expect them to be competitive enough to realistically win 2. And honestly, I think it's closer to being Fly 3-2 than it is to being like BLG 3-1. Like, BLG are favorites in this series, but I don't think it's by a lot. I said the exact same thing yesterday, so we'll see how that ends up playing out. But of course, the only way to know how these games end up going is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0. And this is a huge game 1 win because, quite frankly, they were the better team by far in game number 1. Really impressive stuff coming in from Fly. You had some world-class level performances from a couple of the players on the team here. And honestly, there's just not a lot to say that is negative about Fly in this one. I mean, Quad certainly still has his moments. He's been pretty terrible at MSI so far, even in that series against G2. He got mega gapped by Caps. It just didn't really matter. But outside of him in the mid lane, is there any negative you can really give Fly throughout this? They played the map perfectly. They had some unreal performances from their star players. Like, this was one of the, you know, showcases to kind of show you that Fly is like legitimately one of the best teams in the world. Top 8 at the bare minimum right now in terms of just where they're ranking. And for Bilibili, this is terrifying. Losing game number 1 on Xinjiao, on Nico, on Aurora, on Sion, a lot of these champions that they've had a lot of success on over the course of their time, and also having things like Ezreal and Karma taken away from them on the other side of this matchup. That's terrifying for BLG. These are some of their most played champions across this year, and they still weren't able to pull out the win in game number 1. And quite frankly, they never really looked like they were in this game. FlyQuest really was able to control it from start to finish in terms of their ability to play the game, which is really awesome to see. So let's go ahead and get into draft, because we always start with draft before we jump into the actual gameplay here. Draft is pretty interesting to talk about. I don't think one team inherently wins over the other. I do think that there are a couple of picks that are very positive. Of course, getting Talia on B1 is always really good. Even if Quad was consistently caught out throughout this game, he was able to survive a lot of those circumstances because the Talia is just very difficult to actually deal with. Not only can she be valuable, and those seismic shoves that Quad actually was hitting were huge, but even alongside that, it's very difficult to lock her down because of her escapability and her movement speed bonus that she gets when she's near walls. And so it's actually just a really good pick overall for FlyQuest, and it pairs really well with Inspired on this Sejuani, who's clearly setting up to just be this big facilitator. You pick the Aatrox into Sion. That's been kind of the common Sion counter pick throughout this entire tournament. Whether or not I agree with that or not, I think it's fine, and Bwipo actually definitely showed the merits of that in this game, but really it's the bot lane that stands out in a positive way for FlyQuest for me. They're really the only team at this tournament to be playing Ezreal Karma as a bot lane duo, at least consistently, and you know what? This bot lane looks incredibly broken. Like, I don't know why Fly is the only bot lane to play it. They looked incredible on it versus G2, and they look great on it again here against BLG. First off, Misfortune is never the answer here. I think Elk picking MF is a complete waste of time. I think that's a really bad draft pick that immediately slides the draft gap in favor of FlyQuest at least a little bit. Again, I don't think either of these drafts are unplayable. I certainly think it's, you know, up to whoever wins in the mid game who wins this one, and so it's all really up to execution. But, you know, the Ezreal Karma is going to be a really big problem in this game, and it really made it tough for MF and Nico to really pull off the combo that they were looking for. So really like that part of the draft. Getting Talia early is great. Inspired on something that can enable is nice, and Bwipo had a great game. And then for BLG draft-wise, again, I don't hate their draft. I think there's a lot of things to like about this. Nico Xin Zhao as R1, R2 is like the bread and butter for Bilibili Gaming. You can't really criticize that. That is a perfectly good first rotation for BLG, about as good as you could possibly ask for. You know, we'll talk about it. It didn't really work out, but I wouldn't say it was the problem of the draft. I would say that that was more an execution thing. Again, the one pick that I can really criticize here is the Misfortune on R3. I really like MF. I'm a big MF defender, and a lot of that is because of the way that players like Elk had played it throughout a lot of this year. But the issue in this particular game is, first off, it's basically impossible for MF to actually punish the Ezreal, and Ezreal's one of the few lanes that actually can not only push MF in, but also just outperform her in a lot of these early skirmishes. Like, the bullet time is big, but Ezreal can just obviously arcane shift out of the bullet time, and he's also going to output a lot more damage in these early skirmishes because that's where he really thrives, like these mid-game fights alongside Talia and alongside Karma and, you know, Sejuani. That's really where the Ezreal is going to thrive, and so I really don't like the Misfortune. I think you're putting yourself in a position that isn't easy to play. I think this was maybe one of the worst AD carry picks that you could have had in the meta here, but everything else is great. Knight on Aurora is terrifying. There is a very real chance he can always take over the game on that champ no matter what's happening. Ban on Sion is a huge positive. It allows him to play side lanes relatively efficiently, but also lets him be a front line in these team fights, which is good for him. You know, I think this draft is fine outside of the Misfortune, and that's really what swings it in favor of FlyQuest. That being said, like, it didn't play into the actual execution too much. It did a little bit, which we'll definitely talk about, but really, at the end of the day, this was Inspired's game. He's player of the game for game one. This might be the single best game that any player has played at the entire tournament. In fact, I would really go out to say this is probably the single best game that anyone played at the entire tournament up until this point. It really was that good on the Sejuani. I mean, he was just doing everything. He made Beichuan unplayable throughout this entire game. He made On unplayable throughout this entire game. He was zoning off 3 members of the enemy team in team fights while turning around to hit Sejuani ultimate on the 1 member that's flanking. Like, it's just, he was literally 1v9, and he didn't have to because the rest of his team was so good, and like, they actually played really well, but that's just how good Inspired was in this game. He goes deathless on the Sejuani. Like, you genuinely couldn't ask for any more out of a player. This is, I would say, literally the dream. Like, I don't know if you ever get to a point where, you know, there will be a Sejuani game that will be better than what this is. The fact that you can't play it again the rest of the series is a bit unfortunate. Same thing for things like Ezreal Karma and the Aatrox that looked so good in this game. But, man, if you get a game 1 win like this out of that Sejuani pick, it's super worth it. This champ's been pretty underplayed at this tournament, but the teams that have picked it up and have kind of continued to put trust in that Sejuani and allowed it to be good, they've found a lot of success doing so. And that's with things like Trundle and Wukong banned out here from BLG. Same thing for the Pantheon and the Vi as well. So credit to Inspired. I mean, this is like an A+++ kind of game. One of those that really solidifies him as arguably a top, you know, 5 to 10 player in the world. Like, I mean, that's the kind of peak, the kind of ceiling that a player like Inspired can have on a lot of these facilitative champions. I also do want to shout out the bot lane, who played incredibly well in this game. Busio in particular is going to get undervalued for just how good his Karma was. This was an unreal good Karma game, completely gapped on in terms of his ability to play alongside his jungler and to move around the map in the mid game. You know, really love seeing Busio on these more aggressive, almost mage-esque picks. He's a former mid laner for a reason. Karma, Bard, like a lot of these playmakers, that's the kind of stuff that he really feels comfortable on when he can play alongside his jungle and be really aggressive, and that's what Busio did in this game. Bwipo was incredible on the Aatrox. This is probably the best that the Aatrox into Sion matchup has looked at this tournament. You know, I've been pretty, suspect about that matchup over the course of MSI so far, but this made it look really broken. Again, the only complaint I can give FlyQuest in terms of execution is that Quad was caught out quite a lot. He made quite a few mistakes, but Inspired played the game of his entire life, and Busio and Bwipo were also A++, and Masu was pretty good too. Like, really, he got caught out once, but outside of that was pretty fine. And then for BLG, they just got outplayed. Like, there's really not a lot to say. This is a team that we hyped up being able to generate leads in the early game, and FlyQuest's early game was just better in game number 1, obviously off the back of Inspired and his ability to make plays top lane. He ends up with a really obvious and predictable gank onto Bin in terms of timer that Bin just doesn't respect and dies to. He ends up going down bot lane and picks up the kill on Beichuan after a dive that ends up being a little bit more contestable than they thought it was going to be, and from that point onwards, Inspired just gets to run the early game, and BLG really have no response. And look at this draft. Like, it's all up to Knight in the late game. If Knight can't win the game, if he doesn't have enough gold to 1v9, what? Like, Misfortune Bullet Time's going to win the game against an Ezreal who can dash out and a Sejuani who can't die? What? The Scion's going to take over? Nico Wolt's going to hit? Who's going to follow up? The Xin Zhao's got no gold either to be able to actually, win fights in the back half of the game. It is literally Aurora or bust as they lose this early game, and that becomes a big problem. Now, that being said, it's still Knight's Aurora, and the LPL plays Aurora just a tad bit differently, a tad bit more aggressively, so it still is playable, but Fly keep their foot on the gas, and BLG just look a little bit lost. And honestly, there are a couple players that deserve to be called out. On had a horrible game on Nico. I don't think it's entirely his fault. Inspired was basically glued onto that Nico the entire game. He 100% predicted those clones, just was never really fooled by On's mind games, even though he tried, and that was really impressive. Of course, the American Sniper curve the bullet-esque shots on throughout the game to avoid the clone were absolutely gorgeous, and you got to give credit to Inspired for that, but On unfortunately was the target. He only really hit one big teamfight ult, and even then, like, after that, it didn't really matter. So, congrats to FlyQuest for being able to neutralize On his biggest playmaker throughout the split. Beichuan was completely out-jungled. Inspired Mega Canyoned him in this series, which is really fun to see. Bin, again, falling to that timer on the top side, getting ganked pretty obviously is just a bit disappointing, and Elk picking Misfortune isn't great. Knight had to be so safe in the back half of the game, and he's the only one who can even try and play. So, for BLG, this is a pretty bad-looking game 1. For FlyQuest, this is the dream game number 1. If they can go out and win game 2 in a similar fashion now, I mean, we're going to be looking at like a true upset alert. And so really excited to see where we go from here, but let's go ahead and get into it. The winner of game number 2 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece, and this was a much easier one to digest in terms of where to put the analysis, because really this was over in draft, at least in terms of how these two teams are composed. I think this is a winnable game for FlyQuest if they're not the team that they are. Like, if they're not a team that constantly loses early and then wins late, I think this game could be playable, but drafting Kalista, Renekton, like Annie in game 2 against Knight's Victor and against Elk's Corki and Bin on Ornn, like, I'm not sure how you're ever supposed to win this game, quite frankly, if you're FlyQuest, which obviously we'll get into. I think this draft would be hard for even the best teams in the world, but it's really bad for FlyQuest. And for Bilibili, like, obviously just draft comfort. Just play the things that you know you're good at. You kind of did that in game 1, but there were more options available. You had the B1 Pantheon, which had some moments. I wouldn't say that Beichuan actually had a good game, which we'll definitely talk about, but Knight on Victor, who can take over fights, on Rel, where he can still be a playmaker and still engage. Bin on Ornn, where he can kind of be what he was for Scion, except even more efficiently, at least in this game, because of the things that he's going up against. And so it's just overall a really good draft for BLG, and I think the problems come down to a couple of things. First and foremost, this is a very difficult game to play for Fly because they have to win early. They have to be able to generate their leads to not get outscaled by Victor, Corki, and also they are kind of looking at a couple of lanes that just aren't winnable. Like, Annie's matchup into Victor is really difficult. A lot of people have talked about that. I've talked about that a lot on this channel. It's just not a very good matchup for Annie. And on top of that, I don't think this is an easy matchup for Renekton into Ornn either. I think this is a really tough situation for Renekton to actually generate any sort of lead in. He's not really ever going to be able to punish Bin individually 1v1. Renekton's going to have to make plays elsewhere around the map. He's going to have to try and skirmish a lot, but you're going into Pantheon when you're doing that, which makes it even more difficult to actually take advantage of anybody. Victor's really the only target in the mid game here that you're ever going to be able to go after, and a good Victor's never going to be in Renekton range in the mid game. You're not going to be able to get one of those miracle flanks off if Knight is just warding properly. So very difficult for FlyQuest to end up playing out the early game from a top side perspective. Technically, this is playable from a bot side perspective. Like, Kalista Renata should be kind of neutral into Corki Rel. Like, I certainly don't think it's one of those lanes where, Kalista dominates. There are some lanes where she just absolutely brutalizes the enemy laner. Corki, I don't think, is one of those. I think he can survive pretty easily into that matchup into Kalista, but at the same time, this is really the only lane that has any chance of winning individually, and you kind of have to generate an early lead as this team team comp, if you don't have a gold lead, you've kind of wasted a lot of your draft, and so you kind of have to play for the Kalista Renata. They just lost, and honestly, Kalista looks super, super bad at this tournament. I think it's a combination of a few things, like Kalista's lack of success, I think comes down to, first and foremost, she is just difficult to execute on. These champions that need to win early are very easy to exploit, and I think the bigger problem is that she's a champ that needs to win early, and also teams are very familiar with Kalista at this point. Like, they're very comfortable playing against it in multiple different matchups. This is no longer a new thing to the meta that people don't have a ton of answers to. People have been playing against Kalista and preparing for Kalista all year long, which means that teams are much better at just stalling games and just allowing Kalista to kind of become more irrelevant as the game goes on, which is never really an ideal set of scenarios and situations. I think if you had like an actual hyper carry bot lane here, if Kai'Sa was picked here instead of the Kalista, like, would I like this team comp a lot more? Yes, I actually think this team comp is a ton more playable if you have some out in the late game, some way to be able to play team fights later on in the game outside of Wukong Annie combo, just trying to set up a Kalista Renekton carry duo. Like, what exactly are we doing here? It's very difficult for things to go down. So draft already made it very difficult for Fly, in my opinion, going into game 2, but BLG still had to execute, and you know what? They were just straight up better, especially this bot lane, who was incredibly good in this game. On's gonna get player of the game for me on the Rel. Didn't have to think about this too much, although Knight definitely was in consideration, I promise. We'll get to him in a second, but On really took over this game, was able to create a ton. Like, he had a ton of 3-man ultimates down the stretch, but also his laning phase, absolutely gorgeous. The fake back that they do in the brush around, I want to say like 8 or 9 minutes into the game, that gets Masu super far behind, that blows his flash. It's a 1-for-1 trade, but the kill goes on to Elg versus on to Busio. It's such a huge win for BLG that it basically blows the game wide open and kind of stops FlyQuest from really being able to play from that point onwards. I'm not going to say On entirely created that play on his own, but I certainly think his engages and just his general awareness on the map, probably the most important thing for BLG in this game, but I do have to give credit to Knight. He eventually did get there. You know, some caveats. He was in a great lane matchup here. Victor is super good into Annie. Not only is Quad terrible at Annie, which obviously we talked about earlier on. You know, we talked about that in the G2 series. He almost single-handedly threw a game in that series against G2 just because of how bad his Annie was, and it was bad in this game too. Trust me, we'll get to it when we talk about FlyQuest. This guy does not know how to layer stuns. He does not know Annie animation timings. Like, stop letting this guy play Annie. He is genuinely horrible at this champion, which is a crazy thing to say about Annie, but you know, Knight not only is in a good matchup against a player who's not very good at their champion, but also it's Victor in a game state that's just winning. Like, it's really difficult to stop this champ in a situation where the rest of the map already has gold. Like, there's really not a lot of ways to play that out. If you are FlyQuest and Knight, all he really has to do is just drop all of his abilities at any time, and he's going to get a pentakill in this game, which is kind of what ended up happening. Obviously, credit to him. He still had to position well. He was never really caught out in majorly disadvantageous positions for him, but I don't think this game was particularly hard for Knight to execute on. I think this is actually a pretty easy Victor game, all things considered. Elk was awesome in the beginning half of the game, ends up overstepping in the mid game, almost gets caught out bot lane, ends up surviving because Quad misses being able to layer the Annie stun on top of Busio's ultimate, which is just an absolute disaster. Again, Quad is so bad at Annie, it's actually ridiculous. But outside of that, Elk was really good in this game. You know, Bin was really solid, goes deathless on the Ornn and ends up adding ornaments as the game goes along. The only criticism I really have for BLG is Beichuan, who just continues to not really be all that good. No real great Pantheon ultimates this game. You know, getting solo killed by Inspired was a disaster. And honestly, like, he's just getting gapped by Inspired. It just didn't really matter because the rest of the team ended up winning. This is more so the kind of game I projected from BLG going into this series, where Beichuan isn't exactly the most useful, but the rest of the team is so good that it doesn't really matter. And then for Fly on the other side, it's a tale of underperformances. It's a tale of bad execution, really. At the end of the day, credit to Bwipo, credit to Inspired. I think they played really well in this game, and I think that in a better situation, maybe they could have done something specifically. Inspired, I think, had a good game, which you can't really tell from the scoreline, but Bwipo was also very good on the Renekton, constantly diving the backline, coming very close to trading 1-for-1 in a lot of situations that he had no business trading 1-for-1 in, but unfortunately, their carry duo really let them down in this game. Quad and Masu were just horrible. Masu, mostly because his champ is garbage, but, you know, at the end of the day, he still has to go out there and execute, and clearly he wanted to play the Kalista. He's getting dead of the game because the Kalista was the most useless piece of FlyQuest. It's the part of the draft that ended up probably losing them this game, and also him, you know, dying in the 1-for-1 trade down in the bot lane probably also lost this game. He just was very useless. He wasn't doing nearly enough damage throughout a lot of these fights. Masu's your carry. You can't put him on something like Kalista and expect him to win games. He's not an early game player. We have seen it over and over and over again. I always like to compare Masu to Yan in North America because Yan is this dominant laner who needs help, you know, being successful in team fights because he's not particularly consistent in that phase, even though he's gotten better. Masu is a team fighter first. Like, he's very good at the 5v5s. His ability to walk in and out of danger while never really being, you know, actually in danger is super impressive. Like, his awareness and his positioning in team fights is some of the best in the entire world. He's just not a very good laner. And so to give him something like Kalista, it's very frustrating, right? Because it just feels like you're trying to take away a lot of his positives as a player. Same thing for Quad. Why are we putting Quad on Annie again after how he played against G2? This guy cannot play this champ. Never let him play it at an international tournament again. I swear, man. Quad looks like he does not belong at MSI. Like, there is nothing else to say. Every series so far, he got gapped by Shanks, he got gapped by Caps, and it didn't matter. Right now, he's getting gapped by Knight. Like, I get that these are good players, and these are tough players to go into, but Quad does not look like he belongs with the rest of this FlyQuest team who's trying their best to be able to win these games against good teams. You know, Busio didn't have a great game, but generally he was fine. Again, Inspired and Bwipo did a lot of the heavy lifting, but Fly kind of killed themselves in draft, so they need to be able to rebound and recover. They need to be able to keep their heads on about them. You guys know I think Game 3 is the most important game of the series. If Fly can come back and win this and go up 2-1, you know, only having to win one of the final 2 games is a huge burden of relief, and for BLG, it's the exact same thing, especially because they were able to win Game 2. So this is a gigantic Game 3. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of Game number 3 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 3. Is that even fair to say? Did they win game number 3? Did FlyQuest lose game 3? Did FlyQuest win game 3? I don't know, man. This was insane. The craziest game of the tournament up until this point. They're going to go up in this series 2-1, and they're going to do it off the back of what was just an absolute chaotic mess. I truly cannot describe what this game was like for those of you who did not watch it. If you haven't seen it yet, please go watch it. I'm sorry I already spoiled who ended up winning for you, because this was a back and forth mess, like truly like a mess to the highest degree. And I want to make it clear, this was not a good game. Like, this was not a good game for either of these two teams. It's not, oh, both of them keep, you know, fighting back for the lead and both of them get closer and closer. This was BLG having a 10k gold lead and doing everything in their power to lose the game. Like, absolutely everything in their power. Shout out On, secret agent North American player On tried his absolute hardest to win this game for FlyQuest. It just really didn't work out. Obviously, you know, credit to Fly for understanding that their win condition was just going to get stronger as the game goes on. But this draft is hard, man. This draft is much harder than like their game 1 draft. It's much more playable than their game 2 draft, because at least you have a win condition that I think, you know, isn't just gigantic gold lead early on in the game. Like, you do outscale, you know, theoretically in this draft as it goes on, but it's difficult to get there, man. There's really not a phase of the game where they're actually going to feel comfortable until it gets to 30, 35 minutes. And luckily for Fly, it does get to 30, 35 minutes, not due to them, but more so due to Bilibili Gaming. And so, again, we'll talk about it. We can talk about draft first and foremost here. BLG going with your standard Vi Ahri comp. They're supplementing the dive by going for things like Kai'Sa, going for things like Mbessa. Makes a lot of sense. These are the more normal accompanying pieces to the Vi Ahri, at least in the modern era. You just want to see full-on tower dive potential coming in from basically everyone on the team at any given moment, and that's what Kai'Sa Nautilus offers in the bot lane, that's what Mbessa offers in the top lane. So, you know, overall the draft is pretty standard from BLG. It is still a mid-game spiking comp because that's just what Vi Ahri is, and so theoretically, going into the late game, you might get outscaled, but the problem with that is that you have Kai'Sa as kind of a late-game win condition here. It's why she's so commonly paired up with Vi Ahri as a trio, essentially now. And Elk was, you know, strong in this game. Obviously, I think BLG's draft is definitely easier to execute on because they should have pressure throughout the entirety of the early game, not only through their player differences, but through their draft. But for Fly, I mean, you outscale. Like, you do get there eventually, as much as I like Kai'Sa in the late game versus Gangplank, versus Ryze, versus Senna. It's going to be difficult for Kai'Sa to be able to do that all on her own, and we kind of saw that as the game went later and later on. It's really difficult for Kai'Sa to solo carry, and for her to be, like, the only piece that actually is winning team fights, and I think the Poppy in particular is gigantic here. Obviously, Poppy in general into Vi, Ahri, you know, Mbessa, Nautilus, like even Kai'Sa to a lesser extent. Like, these are all really good champions to play Poppy into, and so I think that really keeps FlyQuest's options open as the game continues to go along. But the problems ended up coming quick and fast for FlyQuest. It really felt like this game was going to be over relatively quickly. At around 20-25 minutes, you were looking at a basically unwinnable game for Fly. Yes, they scale, but Masu's in a really bad position because he ends up getting caught out once again early on in the game and dies early. That's a big mistake. Bwipo ends up getting solo killed on the top side, or I think on the bot side. Gets solo killed by Bin. That is a very big mistake overall for Bwipo. Not really the play that you want to see made. Quad is making a lot of very weird plays. His positioning on the rise has been horrendous throughout this entire game, getting caught out pretty consistently, just being way too far forward. It just doesn't feel like FlyQuest is really in this one at all. And then the sleeper agent in On ends up activating, and with like a 9k, 10k gold lead in the game for BLG, On ends up inting once, and then twice, and then 3 times. And by the way, even at 3 times, it's still like, all right, whatever, man. It's like a 7k gold lead now. Who really cares that On just keeps dying for absolutely no reason? But then he ints around the 6th dragon, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, like FlyQuest are on Soul Point. That's pretty good overall for them. It's not the worst thing in the world for BLG. And then he ints it Baron, and it's like, oh, FlyQuest to get Baron, and they get to push for end here. Like, the game's over. They just won. They won the game. That's actually insane. On single-handedly lost BLG the game, and so they go to push the base. Unfortunately, they just are a little bit too slow. They go for the final base push, and they aren't able to get it. They get aced in the base, and then BLG can just teleport in to the enemy base and take it at 37 minutes. It's a tragic end for North America. Like, truly one of the most depressing finishes to a game that you could possibly see. I honestly think the right call from FlyQuest at that point was not to push the base. I think it was to stay a lot more passive and hope you can win the soul fight whenever that ends up happening. Do I think that you guarantee win that? No. I think On inting throughout the last couple of fights certainly made it possible for FlyQuest to be able to win it, and Masu had gotten to the point where he was like 120 souls on Senna, like he was really going to take over. Bwipo was getting stronger and stronger, and like we said, the Poppy was actually going to be very relevant throughout a lot of these late game team fights, but the impatience that FlyQuest ended up showing that actually really benefited them domestically and really got them a lot of success, specifically in that backdoor against Cloud9 to be able to be at this tournament in the first place. That ends up coming back to bite them because they're not able to close out, and now they're down 2-1. It was so freaking close. Player of the game is going to go to Elk because really nobody else on BLG had a consistently good game. Knight had a couple of really nice moments on the Ahri, some fantastic positioning, but he wasn't really doing anything in any of the late fights. Not that that's entirely his fault. It's just difficult for Ahri to be able to match the same kind of pressure that Rise or Gangplank or Senna will be able to do on the other side. You needed to win this game in the mid game, and Knight really did that. It's just the rest of the team kind of started to throw it in the back half. Elk was the one who was really taking over a lot of those late game team fights. I'm thinking specifically, I believe it was a 4v5 for BLG around, I want to say 5th dragon, 4th dragon, one of those two, where Elk ends up being able to ult into the backline over the wall onto Busio and then be able to flank Masu. Really awesome positioning. Elk almost single-handedly won the game for them with that play alone. So I do have to give Elk player of the game for that, but really, like, they should have lost this game, and that's because dud of the game is actually going to stay on the winning side. It's got to go to On. Like, how can you possibly give it to anybody else? A couple of great hooks early on in the game, specifically that first hook onto Masu to be able to kind of really shut down the Senna in the early game and make her a lot less of a threat throughout a lot of the mid game here. That was obviously fantastic, but, you know, 1 int's fine, 2 ints fine, even 3 ints, whatever. The 4th int, kind of bad, you know, really starts to let FlyQuest back in the game. The 5th int actually just ends the game. Like, he tried his best to lose this game for BLG, and so he is getting done of the game. He was the most detrimental member of his own individual team of anybody on the Rift here today, although, you know, I will talk about why that's actually a bit contested. Shout out Quad, who had another really bad game here, but On was just not good. Like, I've not seen a Nautilus take this many bad hooks and constantly try to kill himself on so many different occasions, but man, he tried to lose this for BLG, and it just was not successful. The rest of the team was fine. Like, Bin was fine, couldn't really do anything on the Mbessa in the late game, because again, Poppy just makes it so hard for the Mbessa to play, and we talked about Knight and Beichuan just not really being able to scale in the same kind of way that the rest of Fly did by the time that On gave them so much gold back in a lot of these fights, but if Elk wasn't taking over these fights, I actually think the game is just entirely doomed from moment one. And then for Fly on the other side, you almost pulled it off. You almost went up in this series 2-1, which would be absolutely massive. And quite frankly, they should have won Game 3. There is no reason that they didn't win Game 3. They just made the bad call at the end of the game to push for base. I think if they just stay a tad bit more patient and play around that soul fight, I think they probably win it at the point in the game that they're at, because their scaling comp has scaled. Masu is online. Gangplank is online. And so you're in a spot where you actually probably do just win this straight straight up 5v5 even if On doesn't int at that point, and then you can just end the game from there. Unfortunately, they didn't have that patience and they threw the game away. Masu had a pretty bad game up until the late game where he was awesome, ended up taking over in some of these fights. The damage he was doing once he really got stacked on the Senna was incredibly high. Honestly, that champion looks so different in the hands of Masu than it does in the hands of any other player in the world. Maybe Ruler, like he's the only other player I've seen play Senna and actually have this kind of success. Masu really is just that good at the champion. Bwipo and Inspired, I thought, played really well here. Bwipo getting solo killed early on in the game was a disaster, but he played the rest of the game really well. I think the good use of his ultimates were really like a big game breaker for BLG in some of the back half of these fights. It really was doing a lot of damage. Inspired played awesome on the Poppy, but most of that was his champion. Not a lot of it was actually his decision-making. I just think he was the only one trying to survive in the mid-game, and Busio certainly wasn't the problem. It's just hard to play Alistar here. Quad continues to get caught out over and over again. I know I feel like a broken record. This guy does not belong at MSI right now in the form that he's currently in. I hate to be so harsh on a player, but Fly is so close to being a team that actually can compete near the top of the world, and Quad is going to be the thing that holds them back, at least in his current form. He simply has to be better than what he is right now, and Masu's got to be able to survive in the early game. He keeps making these pre-10-minute mistakes that end up really costing FlyQuest. That has to be something that he cleans up, but Fly really should be up in this series 2-1. They were gifted the lead, and then they gifted it right back to Bilibili Gaming with a horrible call at the end, but now we're sitting at 2-1. The 10k gold lead being thrown doesn't actually matter, and so it really is up to FlyQuest now to stay alive. Game 4 is huge for them. If they can recover their mental and come back in Game 4 and even up the series, send this to a Silver Scrapes, anybody can win a Game 5, but if BLG can close it out in 4 by winning this third game of theirs, that is going to be obviously massive for them, and Fly will have to remember how Game 3 ended. So a big one here. Who's going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 4 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to even up the series at 2 apiece, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. This is obviously so interesting now because this was the most dominant game of the series. Maybe outside of game 2, that's really the only other one that I think was this strong from start to finish for one team. Fly really just dominated from start to finish. There's really not a lot to say. Their draft was pretty solid. I don't think it would indicate that they would stomp the game this hard, but it certainly was a very good draft that left them in a very good position, especially once they got a gigantic gold lead. And then they just kind of gapped everybody on the other side of the map. BLG made one gigantic mistake in the mid game, and it ended up really just snowballing out of control from there. This is the kind of FlyQuest team that I think everybody wanted to see at MSI, regardless of what happens. You know, I'll say it. Like, FlyQuest through the first 4 games has been the better team. Regardless of what happens at the end of this series, I think it's fair to say that FlyQuest deserves to be considered one of the better teams at this tournament. I would say definitely top 5. I know there's some big Flying Oyster fans out there, but FlyQuest has looked incredible across this series and across this tournament up until this point, and they keep that train going. For BLG, this team looks out of sorts. Like, they do not look like the better team here. They look like the more exploitable team. They look like a team that has a very bad matchup into Fly, and they look like they could pay, like, the ultimate price for it in terms of being knocked out of this tournament. It could really be a bad spot for BLG after 4 games. So let's go ahead and get into it. Draft is pretty simple to talk about. Both teams kind of scale. I think Fly's is going to be a little bit easier to execute on in the late game because BLG went for double marksman plus AP Maokai, which makes sense in isolation because you're playing against Trundle and you don't really want to worry too much about him stealing a lot of armor to go into this Tristana Varus like duo, but all Trundle has to do is steal armor from the Yorick instead, who's insta-building armor because he has to be able to survive this set counter pick on the top side. So overall, Inspired becomes unkillable as this game continues to go along. You have a ton of playmaking tools from FlyQuest. You have Bwipo on set, one of his more famous champions, I would say, in terms of like pocket picks, at least for how he's played, that he considers a good matchup into Yorick. And we kind of got to see a little bit of that, especially in the early game. You have Quad on something like Hui that he's played a ton of, Masu on Jin, which he's played a ton of. The only concern is that you did give over Varus, and it's not like BLG's draft is unplayable. Again, AP Maokai is not ideal, but in this game, it's basically a requirement to build because you can't be building tank into Trundle because that's just going to be a big problem for Maokai, and you also need AP damage in order to make sure that the set doesn't get out of control building armor throughout a lot of this game. So it's just one of those things that it kind of pigeonholed BLG into how they wanted to play the game, and Fly clearly just had a better idea of what they wanted to go in direction-wise, as opposed to BLG once the draft ended up coming down. So we can go ahead and talk about that, because really at the end of the day, this was just a masterclass from 2 of the best players at this tournament in terms of production. Maybe not in terms of like skill level, but like Inspired and Busio in terms of what they have been at this tournament have been 2 of the more productive players at MSI, just full stop. Busio's Bard has been basically unstoppable the 2 different times that he's played it against G G2 and now against BLG. It's looked like one of the best pocket picks at the tournament, and Inspired maybe is having the best tournament of anybody at MSI, at least in terms of like a coming out party. It's actually just been ridiculous how good he's been so far. He's been carrying games left and right. He's been the better jungler in every series except for the AL one. And even then, like, he still was very good in their one win against Anyone's Legend. It just wasn't able to carry over into more than that. Inspired just has been unstoppable. He's player of the game, and it's very obvious here. This guy gets another like A+++ style performance, especially after that game one where he did it on Sejuani already in this series. Like, you know, I'm not saying anything, but man, no matter what happens, Inspired's going to be in consideration for player of the series. That's just kind of the reality of how well he's playing right now. And honestly, doing it on these facilitators, things like Sejuani and Trundle, like, yes, this is kind of expected for people who followed FlyQuest over the course of this split, but for people who maybe have followed Inspired over the course of his career, for him to be the guy that can show up to an international tournament and get like these A+ grades on Sejuani, on Trundle, like, that's not who Inspired was for so many years. He was the guy who was playing Viego and Lilia and was kind of talked about as somebody who needed resources and kind of had to be the main character of his own team. That's no longer the case. Inspired has just become one of the best junglers in the world, and he continues to mega gap H1 and continue to really open up the map. He took like 14 towers in this game. Obviously that's hyperbole, but he took a ridiculous amount of resources and towers in this game, which was really cool to see. Busio's Bard is unplayable against, this is a permaban against FlyQuest. Like, actually, this thing is just perfect. He has not made a mistake on this champion throughout this entire tournament. It's actually been absurd how good he is at Bard. Really excited to see that we finally have an NA player who can, you know, really show up on the international stage. Busio obviously being a big product of the North American system. He was my MVP of the LTA split this year over Inspired because I think he was more relevant, specifically this split domestically, and he's showcasing it internationally. If you had questions about whether or not Busio could be the kind of player that could win games for his team at the international level, here you go. Like, this is a Bard winning game where he's gapping on the other side of the matchup. I also want to give a big shout out to Bwipo, who I thought had a really good game on the set. Does he get solo killed, or I guess, you know, die in a 1v2 versus Bin? Yes, like, that's a pretty big problem. That was a really big misplay by Bwipo. I thought he played that really horribly, but also he was up a ton in this counter pick matchup until he randomly decided to teleport into a play in bot side jungle and basically throw away his lead. And even outside of that, a couple of great plays from the set coming in after that, and some nice ultimates to be able to catch out the Yorick over and over again. Quad had some big pop-off damage moments on the way, which is kind of what you want to see. Just give him a champion where he can be a little bit more passive and allow him to, you know, stand back a little bit further. Obviously, the big problem Quad has had is that he's constantly caught out on these champions that need to be in like mid-range, things like Annie and Ryze that don't really have a ton of range to be able to compete. He still had some problems. Masu ended up getting solo killed by Knight. You know, Knight died for it, so it was kind of worth it, but, you know, it's just one of those games where Fly had so much pressure, it's really hard to highlight individual players outside of Inspired and Busio because they were so much of what this team was doing in this game. And then for Bilibili on the other side, I'm worried about this team, man. Like, they are not looking good. I don't think it's even really been close. They are the worst team going into Game 5. Like, maybe, you know, I'm not going to say anything about Game 5, but, like, at least talking about the first 4 games, like, BLG has clearly been weaker than FlyQuest. I don't even think that's really all that debatable. And so, when you look at this and you look at them just getting blown out and look at their champion pool start to get smaller and smaller and smaller, you do actually get really concerned for Bilibili, and I think rightfully so. Like, the concern is really starting to rise because they played this game really bad. On's going to get dead of the game once again. I don't think it was entirely his fault on the recon, but boy, he is not having a good series, and maybe I'm just a little bit biased, but he didn't really participate in anything in this. And, you know, the Game 3 failures and the Game 1 failures, like, they're coming to mind. He's just not been playing well under any circumstance. He's trying his best to win this series for North America. Beichuan continues to get completely out-jungled by Inspired. Again, all 4 games, even the wins for BLG, I would argue that Inspired's been the better player as opposed to Beichuan. Bin was horrible in this game. I very much consider giving dead of the game to Bim, mostly for that teleport that came in around the, I believe, second dragon, where he just teleports right into the middle of the enemy team and instantly dies. That's like a game-losing play. That basically made it so that BLG could not win this game at any point. FlyQuest had control from that point onwards, and there was really no way for them to play out of it. Of course, ends up dying in side lanes a couple of times as well. Does get the solo kill onto Bwipo, which saves him from getting dead of the game, but not a good one from Bim. Knight tried his best on the Tristana. Not really much he can do. Elk couldn't really do anything on the Varus either. You know, it was just a gap. Like, the jungle is a gap right now. Support is a giant gap in favor of FlyQuest right now. You know, even top lane, I think, is has been pretty Bwipo favored throughout this series. FlyQuest has just looked incredibly good from an individual matchup perspective, and they pushed this to a game 5 as predicted. It's all going to come down to one final performance. Is Fly actually going to be able to get the job done, or will BLG be able to weather the storm and still come out of this one on top? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to avoid disaster against FlyQuest, and they will take this series 3-2. And I'm just gonna go over this one quick because honestly, what the hell do we even talk about here? This was the stomp to end all stomps. This game was over at level 1. If we want to be realistic, shout out Masu, but this game was over in draft. Excuse my language. Honestly, if you don't want to hear harsh language, I try to keep it away from the channel, but you know, it's coming in here. What the fuck is Zilean doing in the mid lane? Like, what are we, like, what are we doing, dude? What are we doing? What is happening? Why did we throw away game number 5? I just don't understand the idea behind this under any circumstance. This is obviously, you know, ridiculous. Like, this is a horrible draft. This is instantly game losing. I think there's a way for FlyQuest to play this, but it's so difficult. You have to get such a big lead pre-level 6. It's actually insane. The moment Masu gets caught 1 inch outside of the bush, which, by the way, what is he doing? Like, is this guy nervous? Is he just not paying attention? Like, what is happening? How is that even possible that he makes that kind of mistake in such a big moment? The moment that that happens, though, and that Masu ends up going down 15 CS at level 1, the game is over. You can't play because you have to win pre-level 6, because the moment that Nocturne hits 6, the moment Galio hits 6, the moment Shen hits 6, this game is unplayable for FlyQuest. There's really no way for them to ever win this game. I don't know what Zilean ever does in a perfect universe. I don't really know what the Lee Sin does in this game either. I feel like at the end of this game, it just ends up being something that goes in and dies, and it's never really going to be able to carry the game. I don't really get that. I get that we're at the end of Fearless, but there are other things on the board. You yourself banned out the Skarner, probably because you didn't want BLG first picking it, but you know what? Maybe even the Nocturne would have been something more valuable, and if you left up both Galio and Skarner, then all of a sudden you can pick the Galio, leave up the Rumble, and then basically force BLG to go something else in the top lane. It's completely unacceptable to ban Skarner in this game, in my opinion. I think that was a huge mistake from FlyQuest, and they ended up really paying the price for it. BLG's draft is incredible, by the way. The fact that they got this in Game 5 of Fearless is actually insane. It's the quad global comp with Nocturne, Galio, Shen, and then Ashe ult, which is insane. You also tack on a Rumble equalizer. Are you kidding me? He got Rumble in Game 5 of Fearless, and it didn't even get the Galio counter pick. Like, how are we allowing this? Gwen went through pick ban, like, entirely. Like, did not get drafted at any point throughout this series. I just don't know what people are thinking at the current moment. I'm frustrated because FlyQuest had all the momentum in the world in this series, and they threw it away. But I guess we can talk a little bit about the game. Like, is there even really a lot to talk about? Knight's player of the game because he was absolutely freaking everywhere. He solo kills quad at, like, level 4 in lane because this Zilean is unplayable. He kills him under his own tower. That's how useless this Zilean is. That's how completely wasted of a pick this actually is. And then he goes on to just completely blow up the game. Inspired goes for a greedy invade. Knight is immediately there. Masu goes for a 2v2 trade in the bot lane. Knight is immediately there. There's a fight around Grubs. Knight is immediately there. Like, he just played the Galio. I mean, he obviously learned a lot from Faker's Game 5 last year in World Finals. That's all I'll say, because this was an unbelievable Galio performance. Enough so to give him player of the series as well. I think he's the only one who deserves it because he's the only one who played like a human throughout a majority of this series, even when his team was running it down. In a lot of situations, Knight was still trying to win games, but man, like, this was a dominant performance. I think On ended up looking incredibly strong on the Shen, easily his best game, maybe outside of the Rel of the series. Bin looked incredibly strong on the Rumble. His equalizers were perfect in this game, which is not always the case for Bin as a player. Elk was landing arrows from a million miles away. Beichuan goes deathless on Nocturne, completely gaps Inspired, although some of that is Inspired's fault and some of that is just generally FlyQuest's fault, but this was a dominating Game 5, the most unbalanced game of the series. I think this is the widest kill margin in the history of Game 5s internationally in League history. It's just a bad look, man. BLG destroyed them, and FlyQuest looked horrible. Like, I mean, again, this draft is unplayable. Dud of the game, all of them, except for Bwipo and Busio. Like, Inspired, Quad, Masu. All of them are dead of the game. Like, whoever you want to give it to is up to you. I'm giving it to Quad because I'm so pissed off by the Zilean pick in mid lane that I think it's completely unacceptable for him to, like, have done this. truly, like, I mean this in the kindest and most constructive way possible. If Quad plays like this again internationally, he cannot play for a top tier team ever again. Like, it's just unacceptable. Like, he's been so bad at this tournament. He has been so unbelievably bad for FlyQuest. He has single-handedly held them back from being a team that can reach higher echelons. And so just for that, I'm going to give him dud of the game. But Masu insta lost the game at level 1 by being a pixel out of the brush. Completely his fault and an unacceptable mistake to making game 5. Inspired starts ego playing and trying to basically get anything on the map and ends up dying 800 times over. He takes literally every Q that he hits throughout the rest of the game. It's every tilted Lee Sin game of all time. Inspired, Quad, and Masu were all horrible in this game. Just completely unacceptable game 5 from them. Busio's scoreline looks terrible, but like, what's the guy supposed to do? It got to 15 minutes into the game and they were down 5k gold, so the Leona just started going in on every target that she thought was alone. It's honestly the right thing to do, and I credit Busio for at least trying to make plays. Whippo was honestly not the problem either. Ends up, not being useful on the top side, but has a couple of nice fights. It's just, Quad was useless. You're playing a 4v5 to start with because Zillion's not a champion. Masu ends up completely throwing the game away at level 1, and Inspired gets so tilted that he runs it down. It's just the worst possible way for NA to lose this, and that's why I'm going to spend the rest of this talking about the overall impact that FlyQuest made at MSI, which is to say, I'm going to take the opposite approach that other content creators have taken. I am not going to sit here and tell you that, FlyQuest lost 3-2, all that matters is the result. The history books, all they'll remember is the outcome. Like, I get it, man. Like, we get so close every time and we're never able to make it work. But this time was different. This wasn't FlyQuest versus Gen G. This wasn't one of those situations where it's like FlyQuest could pull off the miracle upset. FlyQuest almost pulled off the win against a team that you could argue that they played better than for a majority of this series. It's not some sort of gigantic upset. It's not Fly almost beating a struggling Gen G team that wasn't prepping for them. This is like genuinely them proving that they are a top 6 team in the world. I don't care. I'm going to have the optimism around this, and honestly, the tape backs it up. If Game 5 was even remotely neutral for the first couple minutes, maybe something changes. I don't think it does, because I think Lee Sin, Zillion as your mid-jungle duo is genuinely unplayable, but like, this game was such a disaster that it's almost throw-outable in terms, this is a remake in terms of how things go, and it sucks to happen in Game 5, and maybe we are just cursed. Maybe we are just never going to be able to figure it out and never be able to overcome the hump in Game 5, but I believe that this team is as close as we are going to get, and if this team can continue to grow and just lock in a little bit mentally, they can break down the barrier. This can be a team that makes the semifinals of Worlds if everything gets better. I know that that feels like a crazy thing to say, but let's say they draw Bilibili in the quarterfinals of Worlds. Are you telling me this team can't win a series like that? They absolutely can. Let's say they draw a KT Rolster or a Top Esports. Are you telling me that they're definitely worse than all of those teams? It's just hard for me to look at it like that. FlyQuest is genuinely very good. This Game 5 doesn't indicate that because they completely threw it away, and I believe that one day they will figure it out. If it's not going to be them, though, man, it's going to be a long time, because this is the best team that NA has had in a very, very long time. And for Bilibili, they avoid disaster, they stave off defeat here, and they move on to take on their regional rivals in Anyone's Legend. This team looks like garbage at this tournament. I think it's fair to both call out the fact that BLG looks bad and also that FlyQuest looks good. I think both of those things can exist within a vacuum. BLG is not as good as normal LPL number 2 seeds, but all of those people that are saying that, BLG is a team that is one of the weakest at the tournament, that they would have lost to the Oysters and all of this stuff, like, I just don't believe that. I think this team has too much going for them. They could have lost this series, but Knight's too good. Like, at the end of the day, Knight was super consistent, and, the quad global comp in Game 4 was a very smart draft. Like, are there things to be concerned about for Bilibili? Absolutely. Is this team like guaranteed to be, a threat going through the rest of the year? Definitely not. But are they a team that should be disrespected just because FlyQuest, a good team, took them to 5 games? I don't think that's the kind of takeaway I would have from this series. Alright, but that is going to do it for my MSI Round 2 Lower Bracket Day 2 overview and analysis video. Bilibili and Fly is wrapped up. Bilibili is moving on to Lower Bracket Round 3 to take on Anyone's Legend, but that will not be tomorrow's series, so we will now preview our Winners Finals matchup. This is the big one. The winner of this guarantees their spot into the finals of MSI. They only get one more series after this. The loser has to go down to the semifinals in order to get there. It's a LCK rematch. It's a big big rivalry between Gen G and T1. It's Chovy versus Faker in winners finals at MSI. Really excited to see how this goes. It's really hard to predict that T1 is the better team off of tape alone because they haven't been throughout this year, but T1 definitely has been hotter at this tournament. I can definitely say that. Their series against CFO was super questionable, but a couple of nice plays against BLG really put me back in the T1 mindset. I still have to go with Gen G until they lose a best of series in spring. I just have to assume that they're going to win these games, and, you know, as somebody who covered the LCK every single game all year long, Gen G eviscerated T1 in the regular season. Like, the matchup was not close. Gen G looked like the better team by multiple different tiers, and obviously, I think T1 has gotten better since then, and I think Gen G, you know, has not played a lot of games since then, and so I think you could reasonably say that things are a bit concerning for Gen G, but I still think they're going to be able to take this. I think this goes to 5 games because that happens every single time these two teams play a gigantic series, both internationally and domestically. It just happens to go 5 almost every time, but I think Gen G is good enough to be able to pull out the win 3-2. Let me know if you agree or disagree with that take down in the comments section below. I'm curious to know whether or not you guys are all in on the T1 train or whether or not you still feel good about Gen G, but that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're gonna be covering the rest of this tournament, winners finals, and then BLG Anyone's Legends coming right up. Only 4 more best of 5s at MSI before we get back into our regular season content, which basically starts up immediately with the LPL starting the weekend after MSI ends. And so if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of this tournament and everything that happens after it, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all